Scripture reading is going to be in Judges. Judges 18. Is it 18? 16. 16, 18 through 22. Brent texted me yesterday about this passage, and I was wondering how he's going to fit it into his schedule. And I read it, and I thought, well, maybe he's trying to tell me to get a haircut. And then I asked Debbie, and she says, yeah, that's what the message is. When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines. Come back once more. He's told me everything. So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. Having put him to sleep on her lap, she called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged his eyes out, and took him down to Gaza, binding him with bronze shackles, and set him to grinding in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved.
Yes, Debbie, you're right. It did work. No, that's funny, Tom. That's funny. Really good to see all of you this morning. A very good morning to you. And we are so glad to be back. Meeting went well in Tustin, was very well attended. It was a long week. We just didn't know how Vicki was going to hold up, but she did just so well with it. In fact, during the course of the meeting, the first couple of days, she had her cane. But in about the middle of the week, I think by Wednesday, she stopped using that cane. So then the rumors started going around the congregation that they had witnessed a miracle during the gospel meeting. Throw away that cane. But just she was able to do very well, and we're happy about that. But I tell you what, do I appreciate the openness and the lack of traffic that we have in our county. I'll tell you. We met Hoyt and Betsy Friday last as we were on our way down. They were coming back up from Hoyt's appointment, and we met in Camarillo for lunch. And we had so much time because we had a meeting with our taxman in Whittier at 5:30. And we had left so early that we were going to leisurely go down. And as I told the Seedleys a little while ago, we hit the parking lot at Calabasas. And no kidding, we left Camarillo at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's not that far of a drive to Whittier. We pulled up at our appointment time at 5:30. It was a mess. And then coming back yesterday, we hit it again. I thought, Saturday won't be so bad. Anyway, I love the Central Coast of California. Amen. Appreciate the reading. And would like you to take your Bibles and turn to the book of Judges. We're going to spend a lot of time. We'll have some cross-references now, and again with some spiritual applications. But I want you to turn to the book of Judges as we're going to do a lot of reading, particularly in chapter 16. And we're going to look at chapter 13 in a couple of moments. But I want you to think about this period of time. It is fascinating history, but yet it is very troubling history for the nation of Israel, the people of Israel at this time. We know that it was stated quite well, the problem. You'll find it 2 times in the book. You'll find it, first of all, in Judges chapter 17 and verse 6, and then you'll find it at the very end of the book in Judges chapter 21 and verse 25, where the author makes this statement about the condition of Israel and the characteristics of those people at that time. And what he says is that in those 2 verses, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now that's pretty telling right there, isn't it? Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And I thought about that, and we've all thought about that, I'm sure, from time to time when we look at those statements in the book of Judges. Maybe it just pretty well represents the characteristics or the mentality of any society. I don't know. But it certainly does seem to represent a mentality that exists today. That generally speaking, in so many ways, in so many places, everybody's just doing what's right in their own eyes. And what has happened to the concept that there is a God we're going to answer to. And He is the standard of authority, and His Word is our authority. And that we are to live our lives, and our lives are to be so guided by what His Word says and what His will is. And God has not been silent about that. But then here are people just continue to do what's right in their own eyes. There had been such good, marvelous direction under the time of Moses when he was the leader of the children of Israel. They weren't perfect. He wasn't perfect. But I tell you what, he dealt with the people of Israel and they responded. A very positive leader then succeeds once Moses dies, and that's Joshua. And in the preceding book of Judges is Joshua. And here we see the conquest of Canaan. And what I love about the period of Joshua, you really can't come up with too much negative about Joshua. Here was a man of a different spirit. He was a good leader, a positive leader. But at the end of his own leadership, before his life would come to an end, we see that Joshua, much like Moses had done, has given his farewell addresses, and Joshua has great concerns for Israel. And he reminds them that they've got to make a choice. Remember Joshua 24:15, choose for yourselves this day whom you're going to serve. Because he saw directions, he saw things that were happening in the lives and minds of people that very much concerned him. So Joshua dies. And ostensibly Israel is without leadership. No Moses, no Joshua. There's not yet a judge in the land of Israel. And the period of Judges, from the time of this period of Judges, in the beginning of the book, even going into 1 Samuel, and Samuel who becomes the last of the judges and the first of the great prophets of a united Israel, but that is a time period of some 335 years. That time from Othniel to Samuel is a time of some 335 years. Now I want you to think about that in this perspective. How old is this country? About 235 years or something like that. We're talking about a period of time that's even a good 100 years longer than what we've been in existence in this nation. And what does the Scripture say about the people during this period of time? Again, there's no king, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And there we see the vicious cycle that is very much presented in the book of Judges. Without leadership, without spiritual direction, they're influenced by whom? There are still pagans. There are still some Gentiles and pagan people throughout the land, here and there. The Midianites, the Amorites, the Philistines, the Amalekites. And they're being influenced by that paganism and that idolatry, and they quit placing their faith in God and to think that they could even to even look to idolatrous ways. And then they practice evil, wickedness, doing what's right in their own eyes or estimation. And so what does God do in this spiritual spiraling down effect? God allows them to become captive to these people, to these various people. And what became the nemesis to them, particularly the Amorites to begin with, and then the Philistine, which will be a long-time problem and nemesis to them, they would sin, they would displease God, He would allow them to become a captive people. They would then do what? When I tell you, when the chips are down, that's a terrible expression in a sermon. You know what? It really is. I just thought of that. When the chips are down. But in any case, you know what I'm saying. When things are not good, are not right, and even people of God, then what do they finally do? The Hebrew word is soyek. Soyek. Cry out to God. Here they begin to cry out to God. Help us. And God produces a judge, and the judge rises up. And the judge, sometimes the judge was even involved in miraculous events, but had to lead the people in battle, lead the people spiritually, get them to see the error of their way and to repent. And they finally would, and they would be delivered. And the judge would serve his position and would die, and then what would happen? Just a matter of time, that another generation would arise, and what do? Go back to sinful lifestyles and ways. And you see that cycle repeat itself time after time after time, with 15 judges from beginning to end of this problem. What I want us to see in all of this is that Samson, who is the last judge to be spoken of in the book of Judges — Samuel will become the last judge in 1 Samuel, the book that follows — but Samson lived in this very dark period of time of Israelite history. And what's very telling about this, that Samson himself, sadly, though he's going to rise up a judge, he himself becomes greatly influenced, I think, by this dark historical period of time. This is a man that should have known better. It's a man that's going to have to learn some lessons in a very difficult way. Now, it's interesting that as we look at this, and we know that there are without, at this period of time, when you go to Judges chapter 13, and we see that as God's law, the law of Moses was being totally ignored, and there's not a judge present at this time. And when we realize that there is a series of judges in chapter 12, there's Jephthah, and then there's Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And now there's this period of time. When you go to chapter 13 and verse 1, it says, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord gave them into the land of the Philistines for 40 years. 40 years. Again, we read these passages. I mean, that's a chunk of time. 40 years is a period of time. I mean, I'm looking at a lot of you, so there's quite a few of you that haven't even lived half that time yet. Verse 2, "And there was a certain man of Zorah, the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. And his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." Here's God raising up a judge again. Verse 6, "Then the woman came and told her husband, A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of an angel of God, very awesome. And I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. But he said to me, Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. So then drink no wine nor strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death." Yeah, it's just fascinating to me that once again, and God can use whomever he will use, and he uses a woman that had been married for a period of time and had been barren, and she did not have children, could not have children. But he's going to open her womb, and he's going to use this couple to bring forth this next judge, who will be Samson. Go to the end of the chapter in verses 24 and 25 of chapter 13. "And the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. And Manhanadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol." And here we see that Samson is going to become this mighty man, this powerful figure of a human being. God makes sure that this promise is kept, and we know that as he dealt with Samson's father, Manoah, and that's what so much of chapter 13 is about, signs to show that God would keep his promise, and he did. But here God, as he promises and delivers this son, God has a purpose for Samson. And Samson did not make this decision for himself. As a matter of fact, even the parents did not, because here we know that they were told that Samson was going to live by this Nazarite vow. His diet would be regulated. Anything he would intake would be regulated, even to the shaving of his head at times when the Nazarite vow was completed, but into the basic time of which he was going to be very different from the rest of everybody else, would have this long, long flowing hair. The Nazarite vow is a very interesting study, as a matter of fact. But what it was a devotion. It was a dedication. Not all the judges took the Nazarite vow. Not all the righteous men of God in the Old Testament took the Nazarite vow. And for whatever reason, God wanted this to be Samson. And this should have been a constant reminder to Samson that he was chosen by God. He was born to this purpose. He was born to a woman whose womb had been closed. God opens it. Here is the purpose, Samson, because you're going to be used. And I want this to be an identifier. Let me tell you that when you study, even in the culture of the Jews for all these years, the men typically, they kept their hair relatively short. They may have grown beards, and that was probably quite common, but they kept their hair relatively short. In fact, remember what the Apostle Paul speaking about the customs of the Jews and what was kind of natural to them. He deals with this in 1 Corinthians. This says, does not nature teach itself that it is a curse to a man to have long hair? And because that was very much the culture, the custom of the Jewish people, they would have had relatively short hair than men did. But when here was one who had a Nazirite vow, the razor did not come to his hair, and he'd have long hair. And his diet was controlled, and everything was controlled about him. This was a special individual. And he knew that. He recognized that. But, sadly, in so many ways, Samson became the product of that age. And I think if there's a lesson to be learned here, are we not a special people before God? Are we not His own chosen people? I mean, that's exactly what the Apostle Paul said that we are His special people in Titus chapter 2 and verse 14. Peter would do the same thing. There were people of God's own possession. We're a chosen race, a chosen nation, a royal priesthood, all those kinds of things. And yet, is it easy sometimes for us to become a product of our generation, a product of our age, because of what we're surrounded and saturated by in our world? Do you all hear what I'm saying? This is a lesson of the ages. Because what's going to happen? Samson is going to allow temptation and sin to just control his life for a good period of time. And it's going to bring nothing but sorrow and misery to him. When he should have been an example of godliness to all of Israel, Samson makes a series of bad choices, morally particularly, which caused him embarrassment and eventually will cost him his life. And we've got to learn from that. Because if it can happen to an individual like Samson, it can happen to anybody when we let our spiritual guard down. When we talk about Samson, let me go to the other slide here. I think probably, obviously, the most famous story about Samson, other than his being able to kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, and the great power that he had physically, he must have been one specimen of a human being. He must have been. And this incredible strength that he had, because it was God-given, and he was told by God that he would continue to have this strength as long as the razor did not come to his head. And that's all interesting and fascinating, but I tell you that perhaps the most telling story about his whole life, though, is this: Samson and Delilah. And it's here that I want us to look at his life and understand what sin will always do. It was true then and it's true now. What sin will always do. That is what we can call this lessons from the life of Samson. We're going to spend our time now in Judges chapter 16. And if you'll turn to Judges chapter 16, and as we consider the lessons from the life of Samson, learning from Samson, the very first thing that I want us to see is that, as was the case of Samson, and this is just always true of sin, it's characteristic of sin always, that sin will take you farther than you want to go. I tell you, just count on it. Sin will take you farther than you want to go. It always will. Samson is tempted by Delilah's enticements, and all I know is that I have no idea, and I was looking at some various clip art things and whatnot, and they have some of the various women that have played Delilah in some of the old movies. They never did pick any ugly ones, I'll tell you that. And as much as Samson must have been a real specimen of a man, I would rather imagine Delilah probably wasn't too bad to look at either. Got his attention. In Judges chapter 16 and verses 4 and 5. And after, by the way, and I don't want to really skip all of this, but we look at Samson and how Samson, and there were times that they tried to lay ambush for him, and how he was strong and he was delivered and he could succeed, and he did succeed, that God was with him. But then when we come to verse 4, after this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. I've got to stop right there because my father-in-law pointed out to me years ago. He says, Brent, he says, you're a Philistine. And I want to tell you, I was offended when he first told me that. Well, my mother's maiden name is Sorek. And here's this Delilah, this Philistine, and she's from the valley of Sorek. So he concluded I was a Philistine. Different spelling, by the way, and originally it was a German named Soreg, but I can't read that passage without thinking about that. Whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him, and we will will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. And so she's going to gain a mighty profit from all of this by doing this. And so she agrees to this plot. And I'll tell you what, here it comes. It's the trap. Yes, sin will always take you farther than you want to go, and the devil, Satan, knows how to do this. And there's always going to be the trap. We look at this particular text, and we're going to see that she's going to try everything that she can. Yes, to seduce him, but she's after information. And she has been commissioned to find out what's the secret of his strength. What is it that we can make him to weaken him, to humble him? Because they knew that the problem that they had at this time, the Philistines, could not be the power they wanted to be as long as this single fella, this single man was there. And so here comes the trap. As we look at this, the trap always has to deal with the deceitfulness of sin. You see, Delilah is not even going to own up to it. She's not going to say to him or give in any way that she has a wicked motive in even developing this so-called relationship with Samson. Now, he was smitten. Maybe it was lust. Maybe it became love. I have no idea. But I want you to think about Delilah. Did she love him? No. Did she have any interest in his good or in the good of the people of Israel? Of course not. What she was mainly concerned about was her own pocketbook, her own greed, and fulfilling what she wanted. So now she is ready and willing to do whatever she can do, whatever it takes to trap him. And that's how sin is. And I think the thing that we've got to be constantly reminded of is this, is that Satan never has our interest in good. Never our best interest good at all. That Satan is always looking to find any way that he can, no matter what it is, to trap us. It's called the deceitfulness of sin. The author of Hebrews put it this way in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, when they're warned, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart and unbelief in departing from the living God. I'll tell you this, when Samson started putting too much trust in Delilah, when he put his trust in Delilah, he in that sense was departing from the living God. His trust should have remained in God, not this woman. Do we think for a moment that Samson or even other children of Israel, there are times they departed from the living God, that they quit believing that God existed? That wasn't the problem. They believed in the existence of God. They just didn't trust him like they should have. And that's what Samson's done. How many of us have been there where we have placed trust in situations or people or circumstances, and when we put too much trust in that direction, then we depart from the living God. And in verse 13 he says, "But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." And it was deceit through and through that was getting him. The trap. Delilah, she was a trap. Temptation is an entrapment, and Satan knows how to do it so effectively. You stay there in chapter 16, and if you look at verse number 16, it says, "And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death." Does anybody have a translation where it says that she pestered him? Yeah, I see a few of you nodding yes. That's what she was doing. It's the trap. She pestered him, pestered him, pestered him, pestered him. Day after day, day after day, she was trying to wear on him. And we've got to recognize that this is exactly what Satan is doing. You see, he knows that he's just going to keep on. He doesn't give up. Now, he may back off for just a moment, but just enough to give you a little bit of time and then come back and pester again. And when that takes place, and then when we finally give in, that sin is always going to take us farther than what we want to go. You know what I think is such a marvelous contrast in personality and in spiritual commitment is the difference between Samson and Joseph back in Genesis. Remember when there was somebody that was pestering Joseph day after day? Her name, well, she didn't give her name, but it's Potiphar's wife. And what's the difference? I'll tell you the difference. Here's Joseph, a man of God. He's serving Potiphar. Potiphar goes away on a trip, and here's Potiphar's wife, and she has her eye on Joseph. And as I was saying, she's trying to seduce him day in and day out. But the difference is, and it's just so classically stated in Genesis 39 and verse 9, and there Joseph says to her, he says, "There is no one greater in this house than I." In other words, he understood the great charge that was given to him by Potiphar. He appreciated that. He respected that. He had a job. He was this chief steward, as it were, of Potiphar and his household and wealth and all the things that he possessed. But listen to what he says. "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he, that is Potiphar, kept back anything from me but you." Joseph was able to enjoy so many blessings and privileges in Potiphar's house, but not his wife, of course. He says, "Because you are his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" You know the difference between Joseph and Samson in this case is Joseph knew early on the best thing to do was what? Get out of that situation. Do we suppose that Samson should have just been strong, not tell her the truth about his strength, but stay in the relationship? I'll tell you what, he shouldn't have done an about face and left. We're not to have this, you see, unequal yoking with unrighteousness, with wickedness, 2 Corinthians 6:14. We're not to have fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them, Ephesians 5:11. And the reason is because when we don't do that and when we end up giving in, it takes us further than we want to go. And this is what he did. He became weakened and he was defeated. Look at verses 18 through 20. When Delilah, this is back in Judges 16, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She's going to be paid off. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as I did other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. The Lord had left him. His strength had left him. The Spirit of God was not there. I'll tell you what, he is now in big time trouble. That's what sin will do. And temptations will wear you down in time. Satan's so good at it. I think of the proverbial statement that Solomon made. It's a rhetorical question, but in Proverbs 6 and verse 27, he says, "Can a man take fire into his bosom and his clothes not be burned?" You know, we say that today. You play with matches, you get burned. Same idea, but this is a spiritual application. Sin will always take you farther than you want to go. But there's a second lesson to be learned as well. We're going to start back up at verse 6 in just a moment, but may I suggest to you that sin will always keep you longer than you want to stay. Not only will it take you farther than you want to go, that sin will always keep you longer than you want to stay. And that's exactly what Satan wants to do with us. Let me ask you, do you think Samson had planned for things to go this way in his life? We know better than that. He had no idea, but he should have. It wasn't God's fault. It was by his virtue of his own blindness while he still had his eyes. It was by his own blindness. 3 times he intentionally gave her wrong information. He suspected something. There's a reason that she comes up to him. You'll see that in reason number 1 in verse 7. In fact, verse 6. "So Delilah said to Samson, 'Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you.'" I mean, listen to the question, Samson. Why would you give out that information? Tell me, what is the secret so you'll be so weak so that you can be bound and overcome? I think I'd be, I don't know. Would I? Would you? Shouldn't we be scratching our head and thinking, I'm not sure that this is information I should be giving her. And he had some reason to he didn't tell her the truth. What does he say to her? Samson says to her in verse 7, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." And so the Philistines come upon him and they do this, but you know what? Didn't work. He broke loose and he prevails. She comes up to him a second time. In verse 10, how is it? Come on, you lied to me. You mocked me. How is it? Verse 11, he said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes and have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." So they come and bind him new, and that doesn't work. He breaks loose of those. I mean, Samson realizes at this point anyway that he's not going to tell her. But then the third time, verse 13, Delilah says to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me that you might be..." And he said to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head..." Well, we're getting closer because now we're dealing with the hair anyway. "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and like other men." And so while he slept, they came in and do this, and that didn't work. 3 times. He intentionally gave her the wrong information. But I'll tell you what, he finally does give her the right information, and here comes the bondage. When we think about sin, and that sin will always take you farther than you want to go, we've got to be aware of the trap. But when we fall prey to the trap, as he's going to fall prey to her, by she continually pesters him, and he gives in, and now comes the bondage. And that's what you have in these verses, essentially 6 through 14. And when you drop on down and look at this in verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, say, "Come up again, for he has told me all his heart." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought her money in their hands, and she made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. He had told her the truth now, and now the trap had been set, the hair has been shaved, the bondage. It says, "Then the Philistines took him," in verse 21, "and put out his eyes." Look at that. Down in verse 21, the Philistines, they seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. You've got to think of this again, this man. And it was just a powerful man, just in normal stature, though the strength of the Lord is no longer. It's not super powerful like it had been. But here's this man now, and they are using him as a beast of burden. They've taken out his eyes. They have taken out his eyes. They've bound him to this equipment, which he is now pulling a millstone. And they're mocking him all the time. I think in the lessons that can be learned in this bondage of sin is that so many times what happens to us, rather than see it first of all and use the way of escape that Paul says that we need to use in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, we got to be reminded that God will never allow us to be tempted above what we're able to handle. But will God always provide a way of escape? But we have to use that way of escape. I want you to think about that again. The Apostle Paul promised that while temptation is common to men, God will never, listen to me, He will never allow us to be tempted beyond what we can handle. He will provide, he says, a way of escape. Do you suppose God had provided a way of escape for Samson? Yes. But did he use it? No. And we never have the right to say, well, the reason why I was entrapped, the reason why I got trapped by this and I'm in bondage is because I couldn't help it. I was put in a situation where I didn't have any other choices. That's never going to be the case. We can never rationalize or justify that sin. The fact is that in this temptation and the practicing of sin, that sometimes in practicing sin or engaging in sin, and the more that we do it, the easier it becomes. Have you ever found that to be true in your life ever? Be honest about it. This was kind of an overall problem of Israel. As a whole, in Judges chapter 2 and verse 19, it came to pass when the judge was dead, this is kind of talking about that cycle, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings nor from their stubborn way. So many things brought out in that. It just said a judge would come up, he would die, and then what would happen? They'd start sinning, and then their sin would be greater than the generation before. And there might be deliverance, and there was deliverance. But then, here comes again the cycle. And then another generation arises that knows not God. And then their sin is greater than that generation. And so many times people say, oh, well, we always have this generational thing. That the older generation today always thinks that the younger generation has got these big-time problems. Well, you know what? In many cases, there's some truth to that. You know why? Because it's the compounding effect or factor of sin. And I think I've seen it. I think we've all seen it in our society. Can you imagine? Just 20, 30, 40 years ago, just 20 years ago, basically the generation is 20, 25 years. Can you imagine some of the things that are being accepted today? Yes, they were being questioned maybe 25 years ago, but 50 years ago, that discussion wouldn't have been on the table. Do you hear what I'm saying? Look at the subject of homosexuality. You know why? And what's going to happen in the next generation? 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 25 years from now. It is the compounding effect. It takes you farther than you want to go, and then it keeps you longer than you want to stay, and it's staying way too long in this society, I'll tell you. And stubbornness. Judges 2:19, that passes, they did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. I'll say this before we go to our final point. Listen to this very carefully, please. That Samson's flirtation with sin produced no joy in his life. You see, I suppose Samson had convinced himself, I can handle it. I can deal with this. Number one, it's Delilah. She's from the Valley of Sorek. She's a Philistine. Let me ask you. Were these Jewish men supposed to be engaged in these kind of relationships with pagan, idolatrous, Gentile women? What did the law say about that? Don't do it. Is that a mistake? Yes. But here's Samson. I can handle it. And so his flirtations. And they produced no joy at all. It just brought misery after misery and eventually his life. And no wonder. The wise man says in Proverbs 13:15, good understanding gains favor, and he wasn't exercising good understanding. But the way of the sinful or the unfaithful is hard. One of the translations says the way of the transgressor is hard. It's difficult. And it certainly was for him. Well, the second lesson, sin will always keep you longer than you want to stay. But the third lesson is that sin will always cost you more than you want to pay. It'll keep you longer than you want to stay. It will take you farther than you want to go, but it will cost you more than you want to pay. What did it cost Samson? It cost him his ministry as a judge. It cost him his eyes. You know, we read these accounts and just don't overlook that. I mean, can you imagine? They gouged his eyes out, and then they bound him. And it cost him his life. We've read verse 21. They gouged his eyes out, brought him to Gaza, bound him with bronze shackles. Move on down to verse number 28. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me. Only this once, O God, that I may avenge the Philistines for my two eyes. And Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested and leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. There were a lot of people there of whom these massive marble pillars and roof came and fell down on them. But you know what? It cost him his life. And I thought about that. Ask you a question, because there's some amazing miracles that even took place in the Old Testament with judges and the prophets, right? I'm going to ask you, did God have the ability to really teach a lesson to Israel and to Philistines? Did God have the power to restore Samson's sight? You bet. But he didn't. Did God have the right, the ability even to go ahead and spare him from this and put him back in his ministry? Yes, but he didn't. But he didn't. And Samson dies. I wonder, as Samson was there, chained or fettered as he was to those pillars, for that period of time, that how many times he replayed in his own head, why did I go there? Why did I do that? Why didn't I just walk away? Have you ever been there? You see the consequences in the life of Samson, and it's the life of all people. The consequences, it's misery. It's misery. Proverbs 22 and verse 8, he who sows iniquity will reap sorrow, and the rod of his anger will fail. It's miserable. The Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 through 8. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. We see in so many respects that Samson is reaping corruption. And I'll tell you what else is very troubling in all of this. That while he is there, a defeated man, a blind, defeated man, and even Delilah begins to mock him before he's taken away. I mean, you talk about adding insult to injury. As he's there, now he has to listen to the blasphemies of the Philistines. Look at verse 23. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our god, Dagon, this man-fish god. Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. Do you know what they're saying? Our God is bigger than Samson's God. You talk about a blasphemous charge, and Samson has to listen to it. And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson, that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. What a miserable, miserable situation. Well, what does the Bible teach? It talks about the miserable consequences of sin. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death. Ezekiel 18:20, the soul that sins, it will die. James chapter 1, verse 14, but each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and is enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth what? Death. And so James says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren, because plenty of people are deceived by sin. To illustrate this point, the author of Hebrews in Hebrews 11 talks about Moses, and that Moses, as a relatively young man, he had to make some choices. Is he going to stay on with Egypt? Is he going to enjoy all of the blessings and the privileges of being raised an Egyptian and perhaps even take the throne one day after the death of Pharaoh? And don't you love that expression in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 24? By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked toward or to the reward. He made right choices. Samson had not. And it cost him more than he wanted to pay. Brethren, that's what sin will always do. Are any of us, any of you, or any of us, are we battling with anything? Are we battling with certain types of temptation, certain types of sin? Are they taking us captive? I do want to finish this sermon on what certainly appears to be a positive note, and as we've already seen in verses 26 through 30, he makes this final request to God, and God grants him his strength back, and he does pull down these pillars, and the people are destroyed. Samson's learned a lesson. Oh, it's too late for his own life and for his own ministry. But there is a message of hope and forgiveness, though, here, too. Because guess where else Samson is specifically mentioned? Hebrews chapter 11, with all those people of faith. You'll find it in verse number 32. And the writer says, what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. Also of David and Samuel and others, the prophets. Samson had to learn the hard way. And I suppose sometimes that's what we have to do. But I'll tell you what, before it is too late, let's learn the lessons of what sin will always do. And the remedy? Well, that brings about Jesus Christ. That's the remedy. The only remedy. There is no other remedy. Jesus is the only one that can save us from our sins, and by obeying his gospel. Have you come to him? Have you expressed your faith in Christ and only Christ as the living Son of God? And have you repented of your past sins? And have you been buried in the waters of baptism to have those sins washed away? We want to offer to you that invitation because we know what sin will always do, but praise be to God that Christ's gospel is even more powerful than sin if we will avail ourselves to it. If we can help you in making that decision to become a Christian, whatever your need may be. Won't you please come at this time as we stand and as we sing.